Hello everyone and welcome to episode 64 of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. Today I'm delighted to welcome back David, a naturalist and self-confessed nature geek who works for the National Wildlife Federation. David previously joined me for an inspiring discussion about the importance of leaving the leaves and other autumn tips for nature-friendly gardening in episode 52. This time we're embracing Garden for Wildlife Month and No Mow May. So David and I touch on some tips for encouraging wildlife to thrive in your yard in spring and summer, as well as sharing how embracing container gardening can ensure that even in the smallest of outdoor spaces, you can help contribute to creating a place to support and nurture your native flora and fauna. David is celebrating his 25th year with the National Wildlife Federation, so alongside sharing his wonderful gardening tips, our discussion draws on his depth of experience to also explore the sometimes unexpected value that urban spaces provide to nurture wildlife, the relationship between environmental and social justice issues, and the power of community-led nature spaces to create lasting change. We also share the fun we have both had by setting up critter or wildlife cameras to spy on the new wild neighbours that move in when we create habitats in which they can thrive. In these often dark and challenging times, we are reminded that nature can be our sanctuary, providing joy and hope, a solace to modern life. When we share our spaces with amazing creatures and we welcome them into our lives, we are so often rewarded in a myriad of unexpected ways. Welcome, David. I'm absolutely delighted to have you back on the Nurtured by Nature podcast. We had so much fun back in the autumn, sharing lots of fantastic information for people who might be looking at how they could use their garden to support wildlife through the sort of autumn and winter months. And we're back. It's now springtime, so excited to share some more seasonal tips for people, but at the opposite end of the year. But I know it's this month of May is Garden for Wildlife Month over there for you in the USA. Here in May we have one of our wildlife charities put together No Mow May, which again was to bring a focus on to wildlife. So it's a great month for us to be getting together and sharing some information and tips for people who are wanting to sort of nurture their relationship with wildlife at home.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be back. Thank you for the invitation. I could talk all about this whole idea of gardening for wildlife in, winter, spring, summer, and fall. So, or whatever seasons you have where you are. And, it is something that is such a great concept. It's a way that all of us, just simply by thinking about our own space, right, our own little piece of the earth, our yards or our garden spaces, how, with some simple changes, we can actually connect them back into the local ecosystem and have them be not only beautiful and functional for us, but also supporting the birds and the butterflies and the bees and the other pollinators and all sorts of other cool wildlife that can just, safely coexist right alongside us if we just give them some habitat. And the National Wildlife Federation, my organization, has been really trying to educate and inspire people to do this exact thing for over 50 years. We started this program back in 1973 and kind of kicked off the movement here in the US. I think over in the UK, you guys were a little ahead of the curve, a little bit ahead of us. But no, I feel like the idea of gardening for wildlife is even more part of the garden culture and over there than it is here. But we've been working to change that.
Yeah, I think we're always known as a nation of animal lovers, aren't we? I think around the world, that's like one of our big identity flags is we're animal lovers. So I think, yeah, definitely in terms of sort of supporting garden wildlife like birds and things like that, we've perhaps been ahead of the curve. But I think we're also, starting to learn much more about the importance of native species as well, which and obviously supporting our pollinators, which I think is really has become more and more important in recent years.
It really has. And I'm glad you brought up the idea of native plants, because that's really where it all starts. And it's funny because I've been talking about this Garden for Wildlife stuff for a long time. In fact, I'm about to celebrate my 25th anniversary at the National Wildlife Federation.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. And it's one of the first questions I often get is wait a second. You're talking about gardening. Don't we not want wildlife in the garden? Aren't the wildlife going to destroy
Yeah.
everything? And so, just to unpack why a wildlife conservation group has a garden program, it's because plants are the foundation of wildlife habitat,
Yeah.
specifically the native plants that the wildlife co-evolved with over millennia, right? And their life cycles are really kind of in sync with each other. They're like two pieces of a puzzle. It's particularly true of pollinators. In some cases, their body shapes, the animal pollinators, like a hummingbird, for example, that is getting nectar out of a tube-shaped flower that evolved specifically
Yeah.
to accommodate the shape of the butter or the hummingbird, and vice versa. So really, again, like two pieces of the puzzle. So when it comes to supporting and restoring wildlife in, again, sort of the human landscape, our cities, our towns, our neighborhoods, even rural spaces, right? That counts. Places where people are the dominant force. When you want to restore wildlife habitat there, it really begins with what you're planting
Yeah.
and putting in and restoring as much of that native plant community that used to exist before we paved it all over and put turf grass lawns in, like, and sprayed
And foreign
pesticides
species
everywhere.
as well. That's the other thing that
Yeah.
is particularly bad for from gardeners of the past is, we wanted to bring all these lovely exotics in, from far-flung places to, I mean, in many cases it was to sort of show our affluence, wasn't it, really? And
Yes.
show
Hmm.
off and like, oh, we've got this from such and such, and actually realizing that they have sadly very little beneficial value to our native flora and fauna at home.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're right. The garden industry, as we know it in the modern world, really has those roots back in colonialism, right? And,
Yeah.
going back a couple hundred years where it was like, the wealthy who could afford to travel to exotic places, or, who could afford to buy the plants that were imported by, these global trading and that kind of thing, which of course, we could unpack all of the horrible human side of all of that. But,
Yeah.
one negative aspect of that colonial history is that, as you said, we basically gobbled up plants from all around the world and use them really as like a status symbol.
Yeah.
And people with means could have these wonderful exotic gardens, and eventually that democratized a little bit and the modern horticulture industry arose. But those roots are still there because the majority of the plants that the commercial horticulture industry is producing and promoting and marketing are not native species to
Yeah.
wherever, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether it's here, in the U.S. or it's in Europe or wherever, right? Like, and so and quite honestly, it's a lot of the same plants, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
the idea of planting the same plant palette if you are in, a London suburb and, you're and an Arizona suburb, right? Like, that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Like, so the idea of native plants not only helps wildlife, but it celebrates regionality, it celebrates the local. And I think more and more we're learning that there's a lot to be celebrated there. And so, anyway, the idea is that what we're trying to promote at the National Wildlife Federation, and this is our, we do this year round with our Garden for Wildlife and Native Plant Habitats programs, but especially now in the month of May that we designated Garden for Wildlife Month, is if you want to see more beautiful songbirds, if you want to see the fairy-like hummingbirds, if you want butterflies flitting around your yard,
Yeah.
if you want to see the bees pollinating all your plants, it all begins with what you are planting. And the
Yeah.
more native plants you can incorporate, which, by the way, are beautiful and ornamental, and many of which are now, being cultivated more and more, and you can get them more readily. But the more we do that, the more we plant those native plants, that's the wildlife habitat. And that's what Garden for Wildlife is really all about. And quite frankly, you need wildlife in the garden. Certainly, some species are going to eat your plants. Here in the US, we've got white-tailed deer in the east that
Yeah.
are, because we killed off all their predators, wolves and mountain lions in the east. Their populations are huge and they can devour your garden. We have groundhogs, which you all don't have over there. They're basically giant squirrels that devour everything. Yeah, sometimes that happens, but the reality is that we need our native bees to pollinate our crops.
Yeah.
Including in our backyards, our own personal vegetable gardens.
Yeah.
Tomatoes, eggplants, squashes, peppers are just a few of the plants that are pollinated by bees. So we need them. And those songbirds that you love to look at and enjoy are voracious predators of insects that could potentially be pests. So the more we plant natives, the more we're going to draw in the predators of the garden pests,
Yeah.
and you won't really have an issue. Dragonflies, ladybugs. Again, I'm sure there's a host of other species that you have where you are that we don't have here that serve that role. But it's really about creating an ecosystem. So whether you're gardening ornamentally or for food, we actually need wildlife in the garden.
Yeah, and the other thing is as well, the benefit of planting natives is they have co-evolved alongside these supposed garden pests as well. So they're much more resilient to them. So, you get the benefits on both sides that, they're designed, the pests shouldn't destroy. I mean, obviously deer to a slight extreme example, but sort of more of like, your slugs and snails and
Right.
sort of invertebrates. They're not designed to really destroy their habitat because then they have nothing left. So the plants have evolved to, they might take a little bit of a hit, but they will regenerate afterwards as well.
Exactly. And the exact way to think about it. Again, an ecosystem, which is all about connections, right? And balance. And, to use the puzzle analogy again, you're absolutely right. So think about butterflies and moths. They start out life, they hatch from their egg into a caterpillar. And it's really neat because plants, they don't like having their leaves eaten.
Yeah,
And so plants have developed all sorts of sort of chemical defenses
yeah,
that they put into their leaves to make them taste bitter or even quite honestly poisonous. And so the way that butterflies and moths have gotten around that because their caterpillars have to feed on leaves is that they've evolved immunity to those plant toxins of just a small handful of species. So, in other words, they've traded a generalist diet where they can eat anything to really specializing,
yeah,
and they can't develop immunity to every single plant toxin, but they by focusing and specializing, right, they can survive. And those are what we call the caterpillar host plants. And
yeah,
each species has a slightly different one. But you're absolutely right. Like they don't want to kill the host plant because then they'll have nothing to eat. So there is this balance, right?
yeah.
And our native plants are evolved to handle normal natural use by our native wildlife. Most of the garden pests that we have in terms of insects that are problematic in like an ornamental garden or a vegetable garden are honestly not native, right? They're
Mm.
species that don't have the normal checks and balances. So, here in the US, Japanese beetles spring to mind. Obviously, they are from the Asian continent. I don't even know the history. Likely, they were accidentally introduced here,
Yeah, brought in
and
and some, yeah,
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 and so now they're kind of ubiquitous, and they do really devour garden plants and can be a pest because again they don't have the natural checks and balances. The spongy moth is another one here in the U.S. that was imported accidentally and is now everywhere and decimates forests, and the list goes on and on. But our native wildlife, our monarch butterflies, for example, which are rapidly disappearing and are actually right now being considered to be listed for protections under the
oh
Endangered
yeah, I
Species
saw
Act
that, I saw that,
because their
yeah.
populations are in such trouble. Used to be super common. They only feed on milkweed plants. They're not killing the milkweed plants, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, whenever you think of them, you think of those like amazing images of like nature documentaries with these like clouds and almost swarms of them, don't you? And it's really tragic to think like they have got to this point where they have declined so dramatically that they're being considered to be endangered. And like you say, it can be quite simple, like, if everyone who has a garden or I think we're going to get on to talking about container gardening a little bit. If everyone has the capacity to grow some of the plants that would support their entire life cycle, in particular the younger stages of their life cycle, the caterpillars, the egg where they have to lay their eggs and the food for the caterpillars, then it is within our power to help make a difference for these species.
it really truly is. And I have seen it in, my own anecdotal evidence, right? In my own career, my own life. Like if you plant it, they will come
Yeah.
to play on the Field of Dreams movie famous quote, right? If you build it, they will come. Like it really is true. And as long as there's enough natural habitat out there to be supporting
Yeah.
populations, when you create or restore some elements of those habitat in your space, the wildlife will find it and they will show up. And it becomes really powerful when lots of people do it because my one wildlife garden is great, but if there's 50 within my neighborhood, then
Yeah.
you really begin to see the true benefit to populations. But yeah, you mentioned container gardening, and the theme this year for Garden for Wildlife Month is gardening in small spaces, gardening in urban spaces,
Yeah.
and oftentimes that means gardening in containers. And to just explain why we were focusing on that is that there is this misconception that the only people who can create a wildlife garden are the people that live out in the suburbs, who
Yeah.
have a yard, and that's just not true. Because again, if you plant it, they will come. And our cities, believe it or not, are incredibly valuable as wildlife habitat. Think about where cities around the world lie. Oftentimes they're on rivers, which are also used, say, for example, by migratory birds.
Yeah.
Here in the US, many of our major cities are in the major flyways, right? And it's because we built there because there's resources and habitat that we take advantage of, and so do the wildlife.
Yeah.
And so our cities actually are in spots that are pretty important for many species of wildlife. And so, our cities, yes, they are dense, right? And there is a lot of concrete and big buildings and whatever, but they're never going to mimic kind of the nature out in non-developed areas.
Yeah.
But even there, I think it's important to note this idea of kind of pristine nature really
Does
is a myth.
Yeah, it doesn't really exist. Humans have, I think this is something more and more that I've been discussing lately, David, is this idea that like humans have been integral in shaping the landscape for thousands and thousands of years. And
Yeah,
actually, we do have the amazing capacity to do good as well as the amazing capacity to do immense harm. And I've got another episode that I think is probably going to be airing after this one, although I've already recorded it with an amazing book which is called Wild New York City. And in that book, the author talks specifically about the amazing resource that New York City is to wildlife and all of the migratory species that cross it. And it's like, I mean, I've not been to New York myself personally, but it's like your biggest city, I think, isn't it, in the US? And it's incredible that even in this huge, really human dominated landscape, like the wildlife still has this ability to thrive. It's not just hanging on, it is still thriving. And I think
right.
that's what's so important about realizing that actually, sometimes even when you're in urban spaces, you have more capacity to kind of make a real difference. And actually, your contribution is incredibly valuable for the wildlife there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, please do come visit New York. I live not too far outside of New York City. I'm just about 13 miles over into New Jersey to the west. And to your point, in my neighborhood, we sometimes have black bears 13 miles outside of Manhattan. And
Wow.
yeah, you're right. New York City is, well, the island of Manhattan, which
Yeah.
is, people think of, the heart of New York City, but there's the other boroughs as well, Queens and Bronx and Staten Island, et cetera. But the it's not a big in terms of like the geographic space. The island of Manhattan's only a few miles long and barely that wide, right? But it's dense, right? It's
Yeah. Yeah.
probably the densest city because of that, right? And they build up and that kind of thing. But yeah, to your point, there are thriving populations of all sorts of different wildlife species that can take advantage of that kind of environment. And I'm not talking about, pigeons and rats. Yes, those exist. They're not really wildlife in the context that we're talking about. But I mean, there are peregrine falcons, which were once
Yeah.
an endangered species that live in New York City, right? They hunt the pigeons and they nest on the skyscrapers. And there's red-tailed hawks, the famous red-tailed hawk couple
Yeah.
that also nested about a decade or so ago that made a lot of headlines. So anyway, there's lots of wildlife, and you said something that is I want to just pull out, and that is that cities actually can be even extra important, right?
Yeah.
There have been some studies done in Germany looking at urban bee diversity and comparing it to the bee diversity in more rural areas. And shockingly, the studies have found that cities sometimes have greater diversity of bee species. And the
Yeah.
big reason for that is that in cities, people aren't spraying
Yeah.
pesticides everywhere
Yeah.
the way they do on their perfect lawn out in the suburbs
Well, and
or
also the agricultural impact as
correct,
well.
right. Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
what I was just going to say. Or
Yeah.
out in the farm fields,
Yeah.
because, this idea of these little small family farms, this bucolic lifestyle, that still exists and should be supported. But the reality is most agriculture is industrial agriculture, where you
Yeah.
have
And it's
miles and
of
miles of
monoculture.
monoculture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
terrible for bee diversity, right? And
Yeah.
so because the native plants aren't there, and that's
Yeah.
really what the bees need. So anyway, your point is absolutely a spot on that we have this opportunity, especially in urban areas, to not spray the pesticides, maybe enhance the habitat a little bit by
Yeah.
working in some native plants on your deck or your balcony or your rooftop or your front stoop. You don't even have to have your own personal garden space, right? New York City is a great example of a city that has a thriving community garden network. I think most
Oh,
cities
okay.
do
Yeah.
these days, right?
Yeah.
So that's an opportunity to get involved. There are all sorts of green spaces throughout all of our cities, most of which have like a Friends of
Yeah.
organization
Yeah.
that you can get involved in and get your fingers in the dirt and help pick up trash and remove invasive non-native species and maybe even plant some natives through those groups even
Yeah.
if you don't have your own garden space. So there's lots of ways for city folks to get involved in
Yeah, I
garden for
think
wildlife.
like going back to what you were saying earlier about, where cities tended to evolve and develop, they would often be along bodies of water because people needed water to survive. So, there's a lot of these cities, I mean, New York is a great example, isn't it, of have this huge, river network running through them and often there are like conservation organizations that are around those river networks, keeping them clean, trying to like regenerate them as well. So that's another fantastic place that you can dive in and get involved and find like-minded people and inspiration as well, which is also important.
Yeah, it really is. And speaking of that, one of the National Wildlife Federation's mission is to unite all Americans to ensure that wildlife and people thrive in a rapidly changing world.
Yeah.
And it's always been sort of understood internally that people were part of it. But we really decided in the last few years to like be deliberate
Yeah.
about adding that to the mission,
Yeah.
because the reality is that we are part of nature. As
Yeah.
we mentioned a second ago, we have been influencing as human beings the natural world around us to either to benefit the greater ecosystem or not, right? And
Yeah.
unfortunately, more recent history, it's not. But so we're part of nature, and we suffer when we trash nature. And
Yeah.
in particular, there are all sorts of communities that bear the brunt of that. And oftentimes they're low income communities, they're
Yeah.
communities of color, right? And so, if we are okay having expendable human populations because of the way we're polluting and destroying the natural resources, like that's not okay,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why the Wildlife Federation really focuses on that. And so, and I call that out because, again, in cities, right, it's really like you can enhance your own space, your own neighborhood by adding, more of these beautiful plants that
Yeah.
feed your spirit as well as feeding the wildlife. And there's all sorts of research out there that shows that communities that do have, trees, for example, have less crime and things like that, and so
Yeah,
there's just so many benefits.
it's a fascinating subject, isn't it? When you dive into like the links with sort of, I suppose, social justice, really, for want of a better word for it, that, go hand in hand with actually sort of, nurturing nature and nature recovery and how, I think particularly like you say, in city and urban environments, it was unfortunately those people that tended to be really marginalized and their communities were unfortunately often taken advantage of in many ways, and including like being devoid of outdoor spaces for them to use for recreation. That was often quite really reserved for the more affluent
Yeah.
areas to, that could afford the privilege of having having space and having nature. And actually, it does become a social justice issue. And I think you have the National Wildlife Federation has an arm that is specifically garden for wildlife, don't you? That actually makes it possible for people to find native plants quite easily. But you also do support communities as well, and do community outreach and help plant community gardens and things as well, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the Garden for Wildlife program that we have is largely about teaching people about this and inspiring them to do it. We're not coming to your yard and planting a wildlife garden. We're giving you the information and the tools and the resources and again, the inspiration so that you can do it. But we also are working kind of, we call it boots on the ground in many places, largely out of our regional offices. We've got
Yeah.
regional the teams all around the country. And so, for example, in the cities of Baltimore and Philadelphia, our some of our staff who work out of our Mid-Atlantic office in Annapolis, Maryland, are working and getting funding and connecting with communities to support their efforts to, for example, create basically breathe new life into, say, vacant lots in
Yeah.
marginalized
Yeah.
neighborhoods that maybe have, high crime rates and no food availability. They're food deserts. So in other words, there's no
Yeah.
healthy food available
Yeah.
to the people of that community because, the giant, produce markets are out in the suburbs that they
Yeah.
can't get to, right?
Yeah.
And some of this work is centered around creating food sovereignty by helping the community create these food gardens, which then you need the pollinators in order to
Yeah.
have really productive produce gardens. So, figuring out ways where you kind of marry the two ideas, and I actually just gave a talk where I kind of, it just came to me. It's kind of the idea of food sovereignty, right? Like being in
Yeah.
control of your food source and being a player in making sure that you and your community have access to healthy food. When we plant pollinator gardens, essentially that's what we're doing with native plants.
Yeah.
We're restoring the indigenous plants, which is giving the indigenous wildlife the food sovereignty that they need to survive, and we could be doing that in. And when we do that for the pollinators, it can actually be doing double duty because then it provides local food sources. And obviously, this is not the solution to, marginalized communities and food deserts and all of that, but it can be a piece.
Yeah.
And it can really help people on a super local level have access to better food sources. And again, the pollinators are part of that. So
Yeah.
there's a lot there. There's a lot that we can be doing if we just get involved.
Yeah, I love that. And I think this is the thing that's so exciting and inspiring about it is it's like when you sort of start digging digging into it, it's it help like the ripples are just immense, aren't they? It's like, you start with thinking, oh, I'm just gonna go and find, a native native plant to maybe put in a pot on my balcony or in your garden. And then it's like, then you start on this beautiful journey and realize that actually like it has this amazing capacity for human good as well as the environment.
It really does. And let's be honest, things in the world are, pretty grim in many places, the US
Yeah.
notably, right?
Yeah.
And I know so many people are really scared and
Yeah.
struggling and
Yeah.
watching some of the horrors unfold. And I think the
Feeling
simple act
powerless
of,
as well, I think, is a
yeah,
huge thing. Yeah.
exactly. Feeling powerless in the face of these, just horrible things that are happening that are the intent behind which is really to do people harm
Yeah.
deliberately
Yeah.
and doing it in a blatant way, not even sugarcoating it, right? Or
Yeah.
pretending anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's like we're
Yeah.
out to harm you, right? We're
Yeah.
about out to do as much damage to, you and your community as possible. That's what's happening, right? And it's very scary and it can feel very overwhelming. But I personally do take hope in taking those small actions where I can.
Yeah.
And one of them is this whole idea of healing nature by planting stuff. there is very much a spiritual component to doing this work
Yeah.
that even if you're not religious or spiritual or whatever, like there's something uplifting about a very simple thing, a very simple act of hope
Yeah.
that you do. And again, that literally could be planting, one wildflower in a pot in a city, and then seeing the butterflies show up and seeing the birds come to eat the seed heads, after the flower head has been pollinated by the butterflies and the bees and things like that. That's really powerful. And I encourage people to take hope in those small acts because that's what sustains us as
Yeah.
we brace ourselves to,
Yeah, it's it's
keep
it's
doing the
almost a
good
form
work.
of resistance, isn't it? If
It
it's
100% is. At least
yeah.
that's how I see it.
Yeah. No, I think I mean I'm glad you've brought that up. It is a very difficult time. I don't think not just in the US. I think, the sense of the weight of emotion. I know in this country as in the UK at the moment, I mean our laws protecting nature are like basically on the verge of being completely obliterated in terms of like in our development and planning processes. They're literally like we don't care about nature. Everything that we've had for decades and decades is about to sort of be swept away.
Yep.
And it is quite daunting. And I think for people who care about the natural world, it's overwhelming. It literally is. You're just sort of some mornings you wake up and you just think, oh my goodness, is there a point anymore? And then you go outside and you've got your little bird. We've got lovely little robin redbreasts and things, or you can hear them singing, and you think, or you've got a lovely pot of flowers and the bright blooms, and you think, there is a point, and nature is. It does need our support. We do need to change, but it is also incredibly resilient. And actually, we we need nature's wisdom as much as nature needs our support at the moment.
Very much so, yeah. And there is this kind of old trope of like or stereotype of the environmentalists are fighting to save the world because humans are going to kill planet Earth, and like we're not going to kill planet Earth, folks. We're going to
Yeah,
kill ourselves
yeah,
and
yeah,
most of the other life around us. It'll bounce back, once we have wiped ourselves out. Give it another 100,000 years, there'll be all sorts of new life on planet Earth, right?
yeah,
It's not about the killing the planet literally. It's about killing the wonderful diversity of life that we now know. And we're seeing that. We are in this wildlife extinction crisis globally, and it's all due to human activity.
yeah,
As we've been talking about, so many of the things that are causing that precipitous decline and disappearance of wildlife diversity are hurting people too.
yeah,
And so it's like we're all in this together. And the whole idea of like when we save nature, we save ourselves really is true. On the macro scale, on the global scale, we have to be continuing to do the hard work and resisting. But we can also be doing that work on the super local scale and on the self-care scale.
yeah,
When I get overwhelmed, I go out into my backyard and I, take my shoes off and my feet are in the grass and the soil and I plant something. And for me anyway, that is so powerful and reconnecting and healing and recharging of my own battery so I can
yeah,
continue to wake up every day in the face of all the bad news and continue doing this work. And seeing a flower lifts my soul, right?
yeah,
Seeing, and even more so when I see a wild animal in the
yeah,
form of a native bee or a songbird coming to visit that flower. I mean, that just is exponentially uplifting. So I encourage everybody
yeah.
listening to do it. Get out there, get your fingers in the dirt, plant something. Don't be overwhelmed. You don't have to be a botanist or an expert naturalist like me to do this. Like just plant something and start from there. And even if it's in a pot on a stoop, it counts.
Yeah, I mean I mentioned at the head of it, we have a movement in the UK called No Mow May, which is about not cutting your lawn. So it's basically during the month of May, ideally you don't cut your lawn, you sort of let it grow. It's twofold. Really, a lot of it is to do with just bringing people's awareness to nature and wildlife, and the benefit of it. Hopefully you get a few wildflowers pop up in your lawn. Obviously, it depends on your seed bank and things like that. But I mean, I've got lovely like daisies coming up, and last year I was very brave and left a whole patch of thistles, which like probably strike fear in the heart of most gardeners, because they're like, oh my goodness, the seeds will go everywhere, and you're gonna get eaten while you're sleeping or something but like you said, it was sort of I left them during May, and then I was like, oh well, I know like the butterflies quite like the flower heads of thistles, and they're quite pretty, beautiful purples. And I thought, well, our butterflies last year in particular, we had a very wet spring, and we're really, really, all of our insect life was really struggling. So I left them. I thought, oh, I'll leave them to flower, and then I'll do something before they seed. And then before I knew it, they'd gone to seed. And we have a little bird called a goldfinch who absolutely loves
Mhm.
them. And then they'd come and land on the thistles, and they'd pluck the seeds, and they'd take the little tiny black seed at the base of the downy, fluffy head of it. And I was like, and actually this year I've got less thistles than I had last year.
Oh, see, there
Like,
you go. Yeah.
and it's like you have this fear, I think, don't you, of like, oh, if you give it an inch, it will take a mile. And actually, there is this beautiful balance in nature.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we have No Mow May here in the U.S., and you're absolutely right. I think the biggest benefit of that movement is just pe raising people's awareness of,
Yeah.
quite frankly, how terrible lawns are,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that they are responsible for so much of the degradation of the natural world
yeah,
around us. Not only do they literally support nothing, right? They're
yeah,
kind of dead zones,
yeah,
but the typical maintenance of a lawn requires a lot of excess watering, a lot of pesticides, a lot of fertilizers, all of which run off into our waterways, and kill the wildlife outright, in the case of the pesticides. But even more than that, the machinery we use to maintain our lawns is incredibly polluting.
yeah.
People, think of cars and, fossil fuels and all of that pollution, right? Well, cars are a million times more regulated here in the States, but globally as well, than any of the lawn equipment that is using the same kind of engines, right?
I know. I had
And
an amazing fact from a guest recently, Josh, who has he has a movement called the Lazy Environmentalist, and now has a website called Super Cool. And he said it
yep,
was something like 4 to 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the States come from garden and lawn like maintenance equipment, and
yeah,
it's yeah, it's like crazy.
it's
Yeah,
incredible. And yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stats out there. Mowing a lawn with a standard lawnmower is like the equivalent of driving a pickup truck for like 100 miles.
yeah.
And then you multiply that by the millions and millions of people that are doing it every weekend, right? So it adds up, right?
And hauling the
And
waste away as well, the grass cuttings as well,
oh
getting
yeah,
hauled
right.
to.
Those go right
Yeah,
into the landfill
yeah,
where they then break down underground with no oxygen.
yeah,
And those anaerobic conditions, as they break down, they produce methane,
yeah,
which is even more potent than carbon dioxide, which is spewing from the lawnmowers,
yeah,
as a greenhouse gas, right? That's
yeah,
causing global climate change. So, this is what I was saying before, like a personal action that seems so insignificant really is connected to the bigger picture,
yeah,
right? And so if we choose to not mow for the month of May, that's great. That's in my opinion, a very tiny baby step.
yeah,
So at the National Wildlife Federation, what we actually really try to do during No Mow May, which again is also Garden for Wildlife Month, is really challenge people to say, let's go beyond No Mow May.
yeah,
And how about instead of just not mowing, which is great, but how about maybe we add one new garden bed
yeah.
and get rid of the lawn in
Shrink the
that
lawn.
area,
Yeah, shrink
right?
it. Yeah,
And add some more native plants there, right?
yeah,
Because that
yeah,
is actually going to benefit wildlife,
yeah,
right? Not only does it reduce the need for, the amount of mowing that you're going to have to do long term, right? Not just for the month of May, but those plants are actually going to support the wildlife,
yeah,
and they don't require the fertilizers and the pesticides. And, once obviously anytime you plant something new, you have to do a little bit of watering until their roots get
Yeah.
established. But that's one of the benefits of native plants is that they're adapted to the local conditions, whether it's the climate conditions or the associated weather and the precipitation and the soil types and everything. So once they get established, they are generally pretty low maintenance compared to a lot of fussy, non-native, ornamental exotic plants that just are not built to thrive, even if they are approved for your grow zone, and all of that kind of thing. They oftentimes do require a lot more input. So anyway, no Mow May is great. Start there, but we encourage you to get rid of some of that lawn because that's really where you begin to see the benefits for wildlife and the planet.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's the same in this country as well, because I think it then like spiraled into another charity. I can't remember which ones was like Let It Bloom June as well, which was like, this idea that like, oh, you've allowed some of these plants to maybe like sort of stick their heads above the ground for like, a couple of weeks and then actually you just lop them down. It's
Right.
like
Yeah.
any good you've done is sort of a little bit undone, but yeah, it's a great it's just I think this is the thing, isn't it? It's about like just kind of gently re-educating people, changing like the whole dialogue around how our gardens are viewed and how we can, actually make them spaces that we can share with wildlife and it benefit both of us and, the greater world.
Yeah, I mean that's what it's all about. And it's about celebrating the local and preserving the diversity that has always been wherever it is that we live, right? And not just homogenizing everything with the same plant palette found everywhere in temperate zones globally. Like that's boring. Who wants
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
And that it's fine. Like, if your grandmother grew peonies and those are emotionally important to you. Yeah, grow some peonies. That's fine. Like, I'm not saying you have to be 100% native plants. And
Yeah.
again, this idea of like restoring pristine nature before humans touched it is a myth anyway, right? Like
Yeah.
these are human constructed spaces, even if they are naturally focused and are dominated by native plants, et cetera. Like, so it's okay, have fun with it. And this is the other thing too, is it doesn't have to look like a wild mess, right? There's this myth that a wildlife garden has to be overgrown and messy,
Yeah.
that native plants are just weeds and hogwash. None of that's true, right? Like, certainly you can choose a garden design that is a little bit more rustic or wild. I mean, English gardens, right? That's the
Yeah.
whole concept behind them. They're meant to sort of look like a meadow, right?
Yeah,
That would
exactly.
just
Like the
spring
old sort of
up.
cottage garden is really
Yeah.
like, layers and layers and layers of plants on each other.
Right. And so you could certainly opt for that and the wildlife will certainly love that because it is a little bit more like what happens in nature. But here in the US, I'm not sure if you guys have homeowners associations, HOAs.
We
Um,
do not anywhere to the degree that you guys do though, and
yeah.
not with as much overarching power as yours
Right.
do.
Yeah, so they're pretty draconian, many of them. And for folks not familiar, they're basically these organizations that neighborhoods sort of form, and they're kind of a covenant where if you live in that neighborhood, and the HOA decides like what color you can paint your house, like
Yeah,
that you have
yeah,
to have a certain kind of curtain.
yeah,
And extending to the landscape, many of them say like you must have a lawn and you must mow it to 2 inches
yeah.
tall and every week, and if not, you
Yeah,
can get
yeah,
violations and
fines and
fines and
yeah,
right.
yeah,
So having a wild aesthetic is not something that everybody is going to be able to do. But if you're clever, you can stay within the parameters even of the most harsh HOA or other municipal landscape rules. And if you're planting native plants, this could a native plant based landscape or garden bed or whatever scale you're working on, can look just like a very, formally designed garden
yeah,
that is neat and tidy and all of those things. If you have the native plants, the wildlife are still going to benefit.
yeah,
Again, maybe there's not going to be as much cover because the plants aren't as dense as if you went with a more wild aesthetic. But as I mentioned, native plants are beautiful and ornamental, and many of them are common in the landscape trade.
yeah,
Here in the U.S., things like Rudbeckia, the black-eyed Susans,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The purple cone flowers, Echinacea, all of our sunflowers, right? These are all native plants. Dogwood trees,
Yeah,
um, you
and
know,
the funny thing is, like over here, they're plants that people would buy over here to put in their like
right.
ornamental gardens, and it's like they're your native plants. Like,
Exactly, right. And so, like I said, the idea that native plants are just weeds and that having a natural garden means it has to look messy and unkempt, no, not true. I mean, it's all your choice. That's a garden design choice.
yeah,
That has really nothing to do with the nature of the plants themselves. So yeah, I mean, again, I hope everybody listening is inspired a little bit to go out, and whether you live out in the countryside or you're right downtown, plant something, plant a native plant, just do a quick Google search. There are native plant nurseries and
yeah,
and great mail order. In fact, the National Wildlife Federation, we spun off a couple years ago as a nonprofit organization. We can't, we don't we're not a for-profit, but we spun off a for-profit native plant business called
yeah.
Garden for Wildlife. And so,
Yeah, which I've got
um,
an episode with the CEO,
oh
Shabat
yeah,
Ali of. So
exactly.
yeah, you can.
Yeah, and so obviously we're not offering plants for outside the U.S. We're still actually expanding across the U.S.
Yeah,
In fact, this year is the first year that we've got some growers signed up on the West Coast. But there are resources out there where you can order the native plants online and they'll be delivered to your door. So our program, basically, it's a curated line of native plants that we picked specifically to support the maximum number of native bee species and butterfly and moth species and songbird species. And so you don't really have to do any of the work. We've
yeah,
done
and
it
you
all
make
for
it
you.
really easy as well, don't you? All people have got to do is put their zip code in,
Yeah,
and it goes,
exactly.
here's
Yeah,
all the native plants. Like you don't have to do hours and hours of research. You just have
right.
to. I'll make sure to put that the website in the links for people as well, so that
Yeah.
if you're in the US, you can go and have a look. And when I spoke to the it's Shubha Ali, isn't it? Who's
Yeah, yeah. He's since moved on from the
oh, has
company,
he?
but yeah. But the Garden for Wildlife is still out there. So yeah, gardenforwildlife.com. Again, for US folks.
Yeah, and but they had grand plans that hopefully they might one day in the future, you never say never, provide the resources for people further afield as well. But
Yeah, I'd love that. The
yeah,
international version, right? And
yeah,
and like we said, there's no small market, right, for
yeah,
it in places like the UK. I think Germany is known too for sort of people's love of the whole rewilding
yeah,
movement
yeah.
that really,
It's huge in Europe and things, really gaining ground,
yeah,
which is fantastic.
yeah,
Yeah, I love this, David, and I think maybe what would be lovely is just if we could also give people some tips. I know you have a certified garden habitat, and to be a certified garden habitat, you have to. We've talked a lot about native plants, but there's other aspects that you can provide that will help support wildlife, particularly at this time of year. I know
yeah.
we're sort of having a bit of a drought. I don't want to say the D word, but we haven't had very much rain. We've had a very dry spring so far this year. So one of the things that's really important over here at the moment is making sure you've got sources of water in the garden that is accessible for birds and insects,
Right.
shallow pools and things as well. Obviously, if you've got the ability to have a pond, even better, because you've got a whole another aspect of wildlife you can support there. But if there's some other things you'd like to share with people that, maybe once if they've got a bit more space than just a small area that they can help support wildlife further.
Yeah, so the Garden for Wildlife program that we've been talking about, that the National Wildlife Federation has been doing for over 50 years, we've got an element of it that is really the recognition portion, right? We call it certified wildlife habitat. And so for people that are inspired and want to do this and go out there and plant the native plants and provide the habitat, you can have your garden space recognized as a certified wildlife
Yeah.
habitat. And of course, during Garden for Wildlife Month, that's what we're promoting, because it's really how you join the movement. And the more people that do that, the bigger our voice is,
Yeah.
and the more powerful we can be as National Wildlife Federation, as a conservation organization, and advocating and fundraising and getting more resources behind
Yeah.
this idea of Garden for Wildlife. And so there's four things that you have to do in that garden space in order to qualify for it to become a certified wildlife habitat. And these are just the four things that make up habitat, whether it's, in a national park or,
Yeah.
or your backyard, right? Or again, your container garden in the city. So they're natural sources of food, a water source, cover, places where wildlife can hide from predators or get out of the elements, and then places or resources to raise their young so that they can
Yeah.
actually keep their populations going. Those are the four things that all wildlife species need, whether it's a whale in the ocean or, a zebra on the savannas in Africa, or whether it's a goldfinch in your backyard, right?
Yeah.
And the beauty of that is that there's a million different ways you can provide each one of those things depending on your situation, right? So again, an urban garden is going to provide food, water, cover, places to raise young, probably very differently than somebody, living in a mountain cabin
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
rural area, right? So,
Where
but
they've got to
here's
support
the
the bears. It's a
right,
whole
yeah,
different, a whole different ball
right.
game, that one.
But the key thing here, and the most brilliant thing of it all, is that your native plants are going to provide three of those four habitat components.
Yeah.
So natural sources of food, as we've talked about already, the food web starts with the native plants. So the native plants are providing seeds and berries and nectar and sap and pollen and so on and so forth, and
Yeah.
sometimes even their foliage, right?
Yeah.
As a food source, right? And then after the plants in that food web, the insects are there, right? They're the bottom of the protein level
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
food web, right? And then, the insects are important wildlife, but they are part of why they're important is that they're feeding the songbirds and the bigger wildlife and so on. Your native plants are going to provide all of that cover or shelter as well. Think about planting native evergreens. They're going to provide that year round. Maybe you can plant densely, plant a meadow or a wildflower garden or, an English garden inspired look with native plants. That's going to provide all sorts of places for little critters to, again, hide from their predators, for predators to hide from their prey
Yeah.
so they
Yeah.
can actually get a meal. You can also supplement that with, say, a roosting box, which is a kind of birdhouse
Yeah.
designed
Yeah.
not for nesting, but to get out of the bad weather on a cold night and that kind of thing. Just like you can supplement for birds the food sources that the native plants are going to provide with a bird feeder or two, as long as you keep them clean and you're not feeding mammals. That's a no-no because the mammals actually do become dependent on people for
Yeah.
food in ways
Yeah.
that birds don't. So food and cover are going to be provided by your plants, and then so is places to raise young. We've already talked about this. So the caterpillar host plants, right? That's the
Yeah.
place where butterflies and moths raise their young. Um, Bees actually feed their babies pollen. And here in North America, anywhere from 30 to 60% of the 4,000 native bee species are
Yeah.
what we call pollen specialists.
Yeah.
So just like the butterflies and moths can only lay their eggs on certain host plants that their caterpillars can eat, the native bees can only feed their babies the pollen of certain native plants. So again, if you fill your garden with native plants, yes, it's food, but it's food specifically for the babies. So
Yeah.
it kind of checks both of those boxes,
Yeah.
both of those habitat components. For birds, they build nests in the branches of trees and shrubs or in cavities in trees, right? So plant trees and shrubs, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it. That's all you got to do. And that checks that box. You can, again, supplement that for cavity nesting birds by putting out a nesting box, that kind of birdhouse where birds actually build nests and raise their
Yeah.
young, that kind of thing. So you plant the native plants, you're 90% done. Then you can add a water source. And, a bird bath is fine. You don't have to have a big garden pine. You don't have to bring in a backhoe.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, if you want to do that, that's great. And maybe you'll attract wading birds or,
Yeah.
kind of aquatic turtles and frogs and things like that. But, a simple bird bath is all that you need to
Yeah.
check that box and say, I'm just making sure the wildlife have clean water. And, more than just birds are going to use the bird bath too. Frogs sometimes will show up in them and, mammals and things like that. So when you provide those four elements of habitat, based on your native plants and commit to doing what we call sustainable gardening. So like not spraying pesticides everywhere, not planting invasive non-native plants everywhere, things like that. That's how you achieve. You can fill out our online application. It's an honor system. Again, I'm not going to show up in your yard with my clipboard and
Oh, that's
judge you.
disappointing, David. I would have,
I
yeah, I
would
would have been right
love
there.
that. I would love that. But it's an important point here because this whole idea of certified habitat is not meant to be like a blue ribbon program.
Yeah.
We're not just interested in recognizing the people that have deep expertise and deep pockets, right, to make the perfect habitat, right? This is about getting people to just take some basic steps because
Yeah.
we know when people do that, the wildlife will show up, they're going to get hooked. Everybody loves to get recognized for doing something good. And so
Yeah.
it's an honor system, right? And when you join,
It's about pledging your support really, isn't it? And just
yes, that's
showing,
100% right.
like, raising your hand saying, I think this is important and I want to do whatever I can on whatever scale I can.
Right.
And also it helps raise awareness, like I think you can also get a nice a sign as well that you can put out, which
Yep.
helps, you might inspire your neighbors, or if you've got children, they might, inspire their school friends and
That
yeah.
that's exactly right. Yeah, and that's what I was gonna finish with is when you get achieve that certification status, you get a little certificate with your name on it and things like that. You can also get one of our yard signs that really truly do in the most grassroots way possible help us spread the word about this. And I
Yeah.
see these signs as I travel the country and even the world. Anybody anywhere in the world
Yeah.
can participate in this program. And oh my gosh, it's so powerful. And I know for a fact that they start conversations.
Yeah.
When you put out this little sign that says this space is a natural habitat and National Wildlife Federation recognized it, people ask about that.
Yeah.
And they're like, "Oh, okay, so I get it. Your yard looks maybe a little bit different than mine on purpose. And you're
Yeah.
doing it. Oh, and it's actually a good thing. Oh, I'd love to see more butterflies, and then it goes from
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
So yeah, we hope that everybody during Garden for Wildlife Month not only will, create the wildlife garden or enhance what you already have, but if you haven't already, to go ahead and join the program, join the movement, and get it certified. And there's all sorts of discounts and promotions that we're running. So folks,
Yeah. Yeah.
go
Check
to
out the social media. We'll have the
yeah.
links to your social media as well. And there's often, if you go through a few posts, you're likely to find, sort of something that they're running that they're promoting at the moment.
Exactly. Yeah. I think this year it's a 20% off
Yeah.
on the application fee and the signs and things like that. So that's a pretty good deal. I mean, it's not a lot of money in the first place. And by the way, all of that does go right back into running our programs as a nonprofit organization.
Yeah.
We're not getting rich off of selling the yard signs. It's a way that we fundraise to keep being able to do this work. But so yeah, in a way, it's a double like nice thing to do. Not only you've created the habitat, it's helping the wildlife. The wildlife don't care if it's certified. They're not going to read the sign, right? That's really for you. But when you do that, it helps support the work and it gets the word out in that grassroots way. And hopefully it makes you feel good too, because that's important. That keeps our spirits up,
Yeah,
so
I
we
think
keep doing good work.
I think that is important. I know we're sort of getting a little bit towards the end of our time, but I know something we can maybe just touch on very quickly is something about like having fun in the garden, I think it is. And like we were talking earlier about before we came on about critter cams and like wildlife cameras and actually if you've got a little bit more space, they're a lovely addition, aren't they, to be able to sort of see who's benefiting from your hard work as well.
Oh my gosh, I'm completely addicted. So I have, they sell all sorts of, like home security stuff these days.
Yeah.
That's all sort of Wi-Fi, enabled and whatever. And so, I've got a series of these little small, security cameras that I don't like. I don't use them for security necessarily. I use them for wildlife watching. I mean, I
Yeah.
guess they do double duty, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I just stick them in various places in my yard. And then every morning I wake up and before I get out of bed, I'm diving in to look at the recordings to see who was in my yard overnight and that kind of thing. So it's a really fantastic way of getting to see some of the more elusive creatures. I
Yeah.
mean, even the common animals, they move fast and they're camouflaged. And so my big one this year was that I saw an eastern towhee, which is a kind of a bird that it's about American robin size, so a
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
bit
Yeah.
bigger than the robins that you guys have. But it's got sort of a black head and a rusty belly and some
Oh,
white
wow.
bands on it. And you just, I'm in a suburb, but like I mentioned, I'm very close to New York City.
Yeah.
They're definitely not, I would say, an urban bird.
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
to see, like, I haven't seen any of them in my yard this year, but
Oh
I have
wow.
been, I think we talked about this the last time I was on, the whole idea of leaving your leaves,
Yeah. Yeah.
your
Yeah.
fallen leaves in the fall because they're natural habitat for lots of wildlife and, so on and so forth. Well, one of the benefits of that is that as habitat, they are a place where all sorts of wildlife forage looking for bugs,
Yeah.
right? And towies are one of them. And so I think I'm seeing them in my yard this year because I have the last few years been saving and utilizing that fallen leaves as a
Oh
mulch in my
wow.
garden beds. And now there's like a real good habitat going. So it's coming,
Oh,
it's another
fantastic.
way that you can create habitat is leaving those leaves. And so, but yeah, we've got some raccoons that have gotten themselves into a little bit of trouble. I have a little water garden, like a 30-gallon ceramic big pot on my deck, and they did get my goldfish, which were pets.
Oh,
Yeah.
naughty,
And so I
naughty.
need to figure out they're like coming back nightly and
Yeah.
ripping up my water lily and just doing raccoon things,
Yeah.
nothing, no hate towards them, but so yeah, I encourage people to do that, and
Well,
it's really
at least
fascinating.
now with your wildlife cameras, you can enjoy them as well. Like,
Exactly.
they're not like
Instead
these
of
silent coming in the night and wreaking havoc. You can
ex
enjoy their antics.
exactly. Yeah. The other one that has been a real treat this year is and I noticed this because my dogs were like really focused on like under my deck. I've got a deck
Okay.
off the side of my house. It's not very high. So I put a little camera there facing where they were obsessed with, where they're too big to really get under there. And turns out there was a rabbit nest under there. So an
Oh,
eastern
oh,
cottontail mom had
yeah,
her babies,
yeah.
and one day all of these little bunnies started
Oh,
hopping out, and I caught it on camera. So cute.
oh,
And they've now dispersed, and thankfully the dogs, they were able to successfully avoid the dogs, and
yeah.
so so yeah,
It is. I mean, I love wildlife cameras as a wildlife photographer, and having worked in conservation in Africa, they're a very useful tool for conservation, for surveying areas, elusive wildlife, and things, and actually, over in the UK, actually, for an entire year, I had three cameras out that were set around an ancient oak tree. One was up in the tree, and then two were on the ground around it, and basically charted for an entire year like all of the nature and wildlife we saw, and put
oh
it
my
out
gosh,
on YouTube. And it is just incredible. And then there were several times on that we saw species that we didn't know were in the area, that you know were useful for record. iNaturalist is a great place to share information as
yep,
well. And it's just, it's so exciting and it's addictive. Like you said, you're like, oh, I've got to go and look and see what's on it today. And I mean, we were very fortunate that we had a badger set there as well. And so actually, we got the tiny little badger cubs when they first
oh my
emerged from
gosh,
the
so
set. And
cute.
yeah, it's just amazing behavior as well that we got to see. And we've got some in our garden at the moment. We get hedgehogs now and then as well. So it is just incredible. And bird species that I've identified for the first time because we've got footage of them. And it's just, I think it just brings the fun back. I mean, I think that's the important thing as well, is just to remember, like, it's not about making this a job and work for you. It's about creating an environment that is nurturing for you in, like, our hectic world and our hectic lives, that brings you some joy, some, peace from everything that we were talking about earlier. And I think the lovely thing about wildlife cameras is that you get this like secret window to their world, and you can observe
Yes,
behaviors and things that you perhaps they wouldn't do if you were there and they knew you were there. So it's a lovely
absolutely.
way to just enjoy your space even more.
Yeah, and I think what you just said is really, really key here, and that is that the wildlife garden is for us too.
Yeah.
So figure out a way to enjoy it, whether it's putting out some cameras and seeing who's going through when you're not around, or just, like put a little cafe table out in your garden bed and sit
Yeah.
out there,
Yeah.
have your morning tea or have a glass of wine or whatever, and just find the time to do that because it is so rewarding. And as we've talked about it, we all need that. We need our batteries recharged and our
Yeah.
spirits lifted. And it's not just about all the work, right?
Yeah.
It's about enjoying it too.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we want people to do that because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, when people get outside and see and observe nature, it creates a love of nature. And that is something that we're very interested in fostering
Yeah.
as a wildlife conservation group. And you can be inspired literally right outside your door. It's not just about going to faraway places and seeing incredible wildlife from other parts of the world. We've got some really cool wildlife where we live, wherever that is, right?
Yeah.
And that you're probably not even aware of because you're not going outside and
Yeah.
maybe you don't have the
Exactly.
habitat, let alone having, sort of a secret camera out there. So yeah, I hope everybody during Garden for Wildlife Month, but really at any time of the year, is inspired by this to plant some more natives, maybe get rid of a little bit of lawn, ditch the pesticides, and then start seeing all the cool birds and butterflies and
Yeah.
bees and other critters that are going to be your neighbor,
Yeah.
if you just give them a little bit of a home. And it's an amazing, simple thing that is so powerful, both for nature, but also for us, that again, we hope everybody decides to do, and then get the garden certified and
Yeah.
participate in the movement and all those good things. And I'm sure you're going to link to it, but if you go to it's the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Habitat website, so it's NWF as in National Wildlife Federation.org/garden. We've got incredible resources there. We've got a native plant finder, again, North America based, where you can get a list of the top plants that are going to support wildlife that you can then use for shopping. We, of course, have links to our native plant retail line
Yeah.
at gardenforwildlife.com there too, if you want to just purchase directly. But all sorts of other articles and blogs. I've got a book. It's called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. It's a how-to book, really applicable anywhere in the world, even
Yeah.
though the examples I give are here in the US. So that is another resource that's out there that you could purchase from any bookseller. And it is a National Wildlife Federation book, so a portion of the proceeds go right back into our programs as well. So yeah, there's a lot of information out there for folks interested in learning more and getting inspired and getting their fingers in the dirt and planting some stuff to support wildlife.
Yeah, I think that's what's fantastic about your organization. You've been in operation for so long. You've just got this huge resource of information that people can tap into. I know when we spoke before, you talked about, supporting people in different areas. Maybe if you've got a fire risk area, then like how you can garden in that area that's safe for,
Yes.
a fire risk landscape, and that has to do things a little bit differently. And there's just, I mean, I think that's what's exciting is about technology and things, is we do have these resources like really readily available now. I mean, I think you said it's your 25th year with the National Wildlife
Yep.
Federation, and I think, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, when you think back to like that was the year 2000, and it's like, the internet was fairly much for most people in its infancy. We
Yep.
didn't have, all of the social media sites that we had. It was more sort of forum based, and the capacity for us to access this information is just, you know easier than ever. And
Yeah.
it's just about, finding these great organizations like yourselves that have amazing people like David, who's incredibly passionate. He always puts a smile on my face. I love talking to him and sharing sharing his wisdom with you all. But yeah, just it's just about doing what you can and starting small, taking that first step, and then just enjoying the journey and seeing where it can take you. And you can get addicted like David and I, and and it becomes a lifetime dedication, and that's quite exciting as well. And you meet amazing people, like we mentioned. This isn't just about nature; it's about humanity and society and community as well. And the ripples that you can have when you start this journey are just untold. And I just encourage everyone to just do what you can, however small it feels, but just take that first step and see where you end up, and do share with us what you do and how you get on. But
Perfectly said.
It's been a pleasure, David. Absolutely delightful talking to you again. You're just one of my favourite people, and I love connecting with you. I love everything that you've dedicated your life to. You know, thank you for giving us the 25 years, hopefully another 25 years.
That's right, yeah.
Of, you know, your enthusiasm and for the natural world, and everything you've done to just encourage people is, you know, it's a real gift to us now and to future generations. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Fiona, and I appreciate the invitation to come back on. And I have no lack of things to talk about when it comes to nature. So let me know, and I will come back and we'll talk about something else.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know we've got I mean, I think we've probably done like 3 hours already in the last like 6 months, and it's like, yeah, it's just like speaking to a dear old friend. And
yes.
Yeah, it's just my pleasure to host you and share your wisdom with people, and inspire them to just love nature. Even a little bit of how much you love it is just going to change the world.
Well, thanks. And thank you for having this podcast, because you're out there doing the same exact thing, helping people, be inspired and learn how to, just sort of get better connected to nature and help it out. So really appreciate all that you're doing too.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks, David.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I truly hope this conversation has brought some hope and inspiration into your life. I would love to have these messages ripple out across the world. So if you can, please share this episode with your friends, leave a review on your favourite podcast player, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. I would love to hear from you, so please feel free to connect with me on the links provided in the podcast description. But most importantly, thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. But don't forget to simply get out there and enjoy the natural world.